IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Suman, your host for today. We're recording this in the midst of our alumni event called Ideas Shala. We did an interesting exercise called the estimation exercise during the course of 2 days. Specifically, we tried to estimate welfare gains from UPI. To discuss more on what estimation exercise does, why we need to get a good grasp of this, I have with me my colleague Sarthak. Hi Sarthak.
Hi Suman, we're doing it again.
Yeah. We're also joined by 3 participants from the Ideas Shala workshop. I'd like them to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Rama. I'm a software engineer at Accenture.
Hi, my name is Krishna. I work in the crypto field.
Hi, my name is Shihas and I work in banking industry.
Great. Firstly, why do we need estimation? Sarthak?
Yeah, so again, we are here for a particular event, particular reason, right? We are here for public policy. But even before going to that, I just want to look at how and when we use estimation. In fact, we use estimation at every point of time. Even for our own personal decisions, we do some sort of estimations. For instance, if I have to go to the gym, or if I plan to go to the gym, I will think twice. I will first try to evaluate. Yeah, I will try to evaluate what is the cost of this, whether I'll be able to get up early in the morning. And then I'll also look at the benefits, right? I will compare all these things. So here also I'm estimating. But when it comes to the personal levels, right, it is much easier to estimate. Now, if I look at it at the societal level or government level, it is slightly difficult. In fact, it's much more difficult. For instance, if the government wants to come up with a subsidy or it wants to roll out some subsidy, it has to estimate what is going to be the benefit of doling out that subsidy. Or if it wants to roll it out, then it has to think of what can be the consequences of that. And if you don't do all these estimates, you will not get an idea about the size of the problem, magnitude of the problem. You can't do any of these cost-benefit analysis. You will have an uncertain situation, right? So when you're estimating, you're at the end of the day quantifying something, you're coming up with a magnitude, and this magnitude reduces uncertainty and helps in decision making. And again, this is from a public policy lens, but this is equally applicable for private players as well, right? When they're going for any investment decision, they will also be doing.
Yeah. Moving from that introduction to the more specific problem we were trying to solve, or we were trying to estimate. It was not a problem we were trying to solve, but more likely an estimate we were trying to get with regard to estimating the welfare gains from UPI. Now, we all know that UPI has become so all-pervasive in our lives. It has brought in so much convenience. It has changed the way we transact on a daily basis. There is a huge gain. Is there a huge gain to society just from a transaction that I'm doing with another person? That is a question that we need to answer. And to quantify this gain is important, because that is when we will really realize whether the UPI is passing or is creating larger welfare gains within society. So this is what we worked on in the morning today. So to discuss this and to discuss specific methodologies that each of the groups actually went forward with, I have the 3 teams with me, and each one of them will probably go into how they came up with certain welfare gains that they actually came up with for the UPI.
Yeah, so before we go to the teams, and to the individuals, just want to point out that we don't have enough of these studies right now, right? We have had UPI, but we haven't had any of those detailed studies which have quantified the gains through UPI. Maybe we have had some studies which find out, the digital goods, they create this much amount of welfare, but not specific to UPI. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see that some of us tried to do that, and they came up with some fairly interesting projections.
Sure. Ram, do you want to take us through what you and your group actually did through this exercise?
Sure. Normally, it's easy to ascribe value to something that's rare, right? If you're talking about precious metals, gold, or something, it's very easy to ascribe value to things that are rare. But for something that's so ubiquitous like UPI, I would like to have you ascribe to ubiquitous in UPI as well, because that's how well it's percolated within society. For something like this, I think you need to get into levels of details very further down in order to come up with a value. So basically, the methodology that we followed was, if you look at India as a country, is a country of multitudes. You have different sections of people, different there's diversity all around, right? There's diversity within diversity. So, but then in order to ascribe a value to this, what we had to do was we had to bring it down to silos. And what we did was we brought it down to 3 silos with the using the income per household as a metric in this particular methodology. Using that as a pattern, what we did was India would be divided into 3 silos, right? India 1, which is basically what we call the consuming class, those that have a household income of over 30 lakhs per annum monthly. 30 lakhs per annum. This we would call the consuming class. These are people like us. These are people like us who are subscribed to Hotstar, Netflix, and things like that. You have India 2, who you're talking about, the aspiring class, right? The people who have just got into work and they're aspiring for a better thing in life. Here's where, and then you have got India 3, who you call mostly the predominantly rural class. And what they try to do is they try to get into India 2 and India 3, and they're finding it harder mostly.
So what you're trying to say is all these classes that you have divided the entire society into, their perception of UPI or their utility of UPI will be different.
Yes, at least in our in the limited research that we did, we found that the perception does vary because the extent of the volume of transactions that happen using UPI or the modes of exchange, right? It could be cash, it could be card, or it could be UPI. Here, we found differences within these 3 silos.
And so basically the first, the top tier, how do they value or how do they see UPI, and the other 2 tiers, right? How they value UPI? Is there any?
Yeah. So what we noticed, Sarthak, was so basically we referred to a study done by the State Bank of India in a report that they had put out regards to UPI usage. What we had noticed was India 1 is primarily, because it's the consuming class, primarily what we looked at was they are basically card users or non-card users, right? In card users, you have credit cards, debit cards, and things like that. Non-card users, who we are referring to as the UPI users in this case. We noticed that there's not too much of a difference because they're already a consuming class. The value that they ascribe to this, or the amount they're willing to pay to actually, they have substitutes basically. If let's say we remove a UPI altogether tomorrow, it's not like they don't have anywhere to go, right? The ease or the transaction cost that they're involved with, it's not so much because of the substitutes available in terms of cards. So in India 1, we didn't feel that much of a difference. The real difference making change happens in India 2, right? Who we call the aspiring class, because here's where you've got people who are living in the, and here what we did was we didn't break them down to like card users and non-card users. Here we broke down them to 3 subsects, right? You've got urban, semi-urban, and rural people. Reason being because we found very differential usage patterns amongst these 3 sets of people. And what we noticed was amongst the semi-urban and rural users, we found a higher volume of transactions done via UPI, which is understandable because mostly these are people who are more likely to be merchants, right? Which means they are on the business end of things. They're going to receive a lot of incoming and outgoing transactions. So they found UPI to be a very useful thing in terms of it removes a lot of transaction costs, right? For example, if they have to pay to the sellers or the suppliers who are giving them the goods, they don't have to worry so much because now they're getting a direct mode of payment. So a lot of transaction costs that are being avoided. Let's say in terms of tendering change between customers, a lot of these problems seem to be avoided, and that's why the adoption rate in these sets of people are higher, and they value this higher.
So, what was the cumulative number that you arrived at?
So overall, we arrived at a cumulative value ascription of 7,000 crores per month. That would come roughly about 50 rupees per month
per person. But annually it will be around what, 84,000 crores. Yeah. Shihas, your team also had some similar kind of methodology, but it was slightly granular, I would say, right?
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? We're trying to kind of ascertain a particular value to everyone understand there is a value to it, and we are trying to kind of get to numbers to that. The approach broadly is similar. I think we kind of went into a little more detail. One, with the perspective of the scope area for us to kind of really analyze this particular estimation as an exercise. We looked at solely the guys who are actually using UPI today, active users. I know, on a widespread, it is impacting everyone's life. There could be an argument there are still, maybe a small little portion of our population still not kind of have reached to the UPI when it comes to digital adoption or whatever that stuff is, or financial literacy and so on and so forth. But from our perspective, we looked at it strictly from a UPI user perspective, which is roughly around about 35 to 36 crores is essentially what we have now. And if you put that into the perspective of the density or how many times they are using it, on an average, the latest stats is we see roughly around about 100 crore transaction. 1,000 crores. Yeah, see the magnitude. So on an average, we're talking about every user doing 30 transactions in a month, which, for us, it doesn't sound very big number, right? Because we do this on a daily basis, and we belong to possibly, again, going back to Ram's point, there is an ultra rich who perhaps don't need UPI because it's not necessarily substituting anything. They do have the access in the form of making payments using card or whatever it is. Another thing about UPI for an ultra rich, they need a global utility, and UPI at this stage hasn't kind of really reached
that point.
Yeah, I think the middle segment, which is upper middle class and lower middle class, is where it is literally a game changer.
Yeah, so which is basically the aspiring class.
Yes, we kind of termed it differently, but broadly it meant the same. And the way we went about, kind of really asking the question around, how do I put a value to it? There are two angles we looked at. One is the cost efficiency. UPI is free, and if someone were to do the transaction using the old ways of transferring money over, it could be a cash, or it could be an NEFT or a check or whatever that stuff is, and we know how much it costs, right? As an example, if we were to go to an ATM and take out the money, whatever the limit of 5 transactions in a month and so on and so forth, beyond that you're paying 20 rupees in GST and all of the stuff. And we looked at that. That's a real number, the cost efficiency. Then there is a time efficiency, or a convenience, in a sense, and that differs as well. For an ultra rich, an amount of, say, 60 minutes to go to an ATM and pick up cash could be a higher perceived value versus someone in the lower strata income, it could be a lower value. So we kind of combined these two to understand what could be the utility to the question what we have, which is what's the welfare ticket size of UPI. That's the way we kind of went about it.
So interesting, this interesting thing here. Now, so your team.
Before we go there, Sarthak, do you want to get the number that they have?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
So again, just kind of going back, we're talking about 33 crores users doing 1,000 crore unique transaction every month, and we are putting the value of time efficiency and cost efficiency both, and the estimates what we have roughly is, in terms of the welfare or the utility, it's roughly around about 60,000 crores is the estimate.
Per year, right?
Per year, yes, it is. Now, if you were to translate that, one of the ways in which essentially this is about, the value what we are creating, right? If you were to kind of pass this on to the user to kind of pay for it, you can look at this as a subscription model, like users paying a monthly subscription. So if you do that 60 or 1,000 crores on a base of 33 crores unique users what we have, it works out to be roughly around about 150 rupees per month roughly. Now that's an average. We understand the affordability and the way in which you need to come up with a bit of pricing strategy, etc. That needs to be kind of worked out, and that can, of course, vary basis the income strata what we have, or basis the density of transaction, or
volume,
urban, rural, volume, etc., etc. So there are multiple ways to kind of we have
price differentiation. It is a secondary thing right now, but it's interesting how your numbers are not very different from the other team's number. But interesting thing, Krishna, your team also did the same thing, but your numbers are slightly different, if I'm not wrong. And your methodology is also different, right? And you have possibly looked at multiple angles, right? So both Rama as well as Shihas team, you have looked at it from the consumer's perspective. And Krishna, I think you have gone slightly beyond that. So what was your methodology? In fact, before we go to Krishna, I think we should take a quick break.
Sure.
We're almost around 15 minutes now. Let's take a quick break, and then when we are back, we'll talk.
Before we go into the break, I'd like to tell all our listeners about all the courses that we have to offer at Takshashila. The Graduate Certificate Program in Public Policy, the GCPP, is a 12-week program, like most of you would know. The next cohort begins on 13th Jan, and applications are now open. So please head on to school.takshashila.org.in to apply for this course. We'll come back after this break.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Welcome back, everybody. We're discussing an interesting exercise that we did today at the Ideas Shala event at Takshashila Institution. We are discussing welfare gains from UPI. We've heard two participants talk about this. We'll move on to the third, who have a different methodology and widely different number also that they have come up with. To talk about that, we'll go over to Krishna.
Thanks, Suman. So the way we approached the problem was quite different, maybe because we had a couple of people on the team who had some background in the payments industry. So came with that bias or vantage point, whichever way you call it. So the way we thought about the problem statement was that we acknowledged upfront that currently UPI is not available to everybody in India. So if we have to quantify the welfare gains, it is probably best done with regard to the segment of users who are currently using UPI. And the way we arrived at that number was that it's widely known the smartphone user population in India is between 650 million to 700 million people, of which we have data from NPCI that 330 million users use UPI. And this is the number of people who have ever used UPI. So this is the cumulative number of people who have ever used UPI. Industry sources tell us that the people who are using UPI on a monthly basis, what one would call monthly transacting user base of UPI, is in the 170 to 180 million range at this point of time. We made a few phone calls to check how this particular base was distributed in terms of usage of UPI itself across these 180 million users, which are estimated to be using this on a monthly basis. And what we found was that there were substantial skews, as one would expect, in a distribution of this nature. To expand upon that, what we found was about 2/3 of the user base is using UPI up to 10 times a month. There is a small portion of the user base, call it about 5% of the user base at most, which is using UPI for more than 300 transactions, more than 100 transactions a month. So on one hand, you got a large portion using it less than 10 times a month, and a small portion using it more than 100 times a month. Now, there is a middle, which is, closer to about 20% to 30% of the user base, which is using it between 10 to 100 times a month. Now, the utility in terms of UPI for each of the user segments is going to be dramatically different. Because if you're going to use UPI once or twice a month, the benefit to you as a user and the willingness to pay, if I had to proxy that for the benefit, would be dramatically different. So we went back to say, how do we quantify what the willingness to pay would be? And here, I think we conflated economic cost and finance costs. So I would caveat my discussion by saying that's one shortcoming with the approach which we have taken. With that out of the way, we computed the cost of each transaction. So NPCI tells us that each UPI transaction, on average, has a value of 150 rupees. So we tried to go back and figure out for a 150 rupee transaction, made through other mechanisms, for example, cash or debit card, what would be the cost of the transaction for the system as a whole? And we arrived at a number of about 0.9 rupees per transaction is what would be the cost of a transaction if done through a non-UPI method. Using that as our proxy, we said different groups of users, the power users, the middle set, or the very infrequent users, would have very different preferences of what they would value UPI at and what they would be willing to pay. Long story short, using this methodology, we came out with a number of about 3,100 crores on an annual basis as our number for the benefit of UPI from a direct perspective, which is a substitution perspective. Then we also worked on an intangible benefit aspect, which takes into account aspects like cost of time, the convenience factor, etc. And that number turned out to be slightly higher, which is slightly more than 4,000 crores. So in aggregate, we ended up with a number which is closer to 7,500 crores as the number for a full year, which is, again, as Suman said, dramatically different from the first two groups here.
Yeah, so basically the user base and the number of transactions that you have considered, since you are from the payments industry, you have some better data maybe, and that possibly is one of the reasons why the number varies, right? So we have three numbers here. One is somewhere around 84,000 crores and one is 60,000 crores, another is 7,000 crores. And if you compare it with the GDP numbers, right, it will be in the range of what, 0.3 to 0.03.
Yes.
In fact, I should use the other way around, 0.03% to 0.3% of the GDP. Now, I was wondering what all points we can also consider, right? At this point of time, we have looked at it from the perspective of the users. You have also added one more point, how users benefit because of the cost and all these things. But yeah, some of these things might be difficult to quantify, but because of UPI, right, maybe in the future, right, maybe you can have better innovation, better technologies, right? You have now created a platform on the basis of which maybe you can have some developments in the future. That is something that we have not been, I mean, of course, because of our own limitations, time limitations, we have not been able to do that. But again, when it comes to the decision-making part, maybe that is something which will play
also,
its
when
weight.
we are making decisions on this, I think we should look at the subsidy that or the
how much the government at this point of time invests, right? And some estimates point out that it is somewhere around 1,400 to 1,500 crores. So even if you take the most conservative estimate, which is around 7,000 crores, then also the government's investment spending on this thing makes sense. And also some of the numbers that we discussed, right? It can possibly help in the pricing thing of UPI maybe. At this point of time, there is this discussion whether UPI should be free priced. So maybe.
Yeah. So I think the crux of the problem also lies in getting more people onto UPI, which essentially means economic growth, which essentially means economic growth for everybody, not just for the top. Because, as you get more people from the lower rungs of income into this thing, usage, adaptability, and all other factors, and obviously costs per user will also reduce. So
in case if you have to do the exercise again, right? Let's say you have to revise your methodology. Anything that you would like to incorporate, consider, apart from the things that we discuss?
I think from the intangible portion, right?
Yeah.
There are lots of stuff which we did not consider.
Yeah.
Looking back, reflecting on it, right? One was the point, Sarthak, you mentioned about the business models itself.
Yeah.
Because there are multiple use cases and even businesses which have been created because UPI exists. The availability of an instant payment, low-cost settlement system can create business models which are otherwise not possible in a cash format. Like, for example.
But the counterpoint to that is this is one technology, the UPI, which the government has favored, which the RBI has favored. Has this also led, or does this create a system where other technologies maybe something we would have got something else, and we don't know.
Counterfactual is very hard to check. Absolutely. So one was the alternate business models, right? The second part was, how do you measure intangibles in depth? For example, when you go to a street vendor,
Yeah,
and
you
pay
did
with
an
UPI.
interesting. Your group did an interesting survey on that.
Yes,
right?
so so my teammates went down onto Church Street, which is where we were located today, and spoke to multiple street vendors about how they use cash, how they use UPI. And I think two aspects came to the fore. One was, there is definitely a pride in digital payments. Because what happens is, when you use UPI, and this is especially true as you go down income strata, as you go into smaller markets, what you find is that people are very proud to be part of this revolution. They feel included, because so far technology had left people behind. And as a street vendor, if you're taking 10 rupees via UPI, your eyes light up, saying that I'm also in as part of the revolution. The second part was, because UPI is instant payments, unlike say cards, wherein settlement happens the next day or the day after, people are able to rotate their money faster. And that preference for UPI versus cards was very pronounced. And the willingness to trade off between UPI and cash was much easier, which does not happen with cards.
Yeah, interesting. Shihas, you want to add something?
I think, and I just want to kind of take off from what he mentioned, right? At least from the analysis, what we did, we largely looked at the perspective of a common man. There is a
person.
Common person, yeah. Inclusion, diversity, yeah. Of course. The perspective is, the business side of stuff, which is massive. I mean, it might not be a brilliant catalyst for a big, large corporation per se, but if you look at a micro, small enterprises, which is a significant, business transforming kind of technology, which they're getting it for free today. And I'm sure they're ready to kind of pay for. To your question, are they ready to pay for it? Absolutely yes, because it's a massive catalyst. That's number one. Number two, if you look at the alternate, which still I think a smaller portion of our people using, which is cash, I don't think we've kind of necessarily double clicked on it enough, which is the risk side of stuff. You carrying cash and managing cash, strictly in the form of theft and blah blah blah, versus the chances of you losing money through UPI is almost zero. It's not zero actually.
So there is significant fraud fraud detection that happens with UPI too.
Yes, but if you look at the net of, I'm sure it is positive on UPI, because you're not literally physically carrying cash and then a threat of losing money or whatever it is. So that's another piece which is quite interesting, the security side of stuff, the risk side of stuff, which we haven't necessarily gone into a bit of details there.
I think one big learning that we had, from my team we had, was the fact that we should look at this as one part of the big infrastructure, right? We have to look at this as a digital public infrastructure. So for example, Krishna brought about a very good point about inclusivity, how the very fact that you're able to make payments in a digital mode makes you feel more included. Technology is making you feel inclusive. It's similar to how a village would get a new bus stop, right? It's in terms of a physical civil infrastructure. Suddenly the village feels included in terms of general aspects of connectivity. I think this brought about a very similar change, and it's also a very shining light for the general space of digital public infrastructure, which I think India's leading the way in a very good way in this thing. The other thing we learned was also the fact that what we didn't do further in our analysis was we didn't consider the merchants side of it, right? Wherein the volume of transactions is much higher for that. So definitely we would have to look at the way they would value UPI as a whole. So these were our big learnings.
Sure. Thanks. I think this was a very interesting exercise first and an interesting discussion here. The takeaways from this, sure, we can discuss UPI, what it can do for all of us and the gains out of it. But I think the larger takeaway for me at least was the estimation exercise itself and what it can do for us in public policy in making our estimates or projections more credible, more plausible, and lending more heft to the argument that we want to make. So if there's anything else anyone else here wants to say, please go ahead.
Yeah, just want to add one thing. Again, estimation exercise is something which helps in this decision-making part. But what is also important is that this process should be transparent. What are the assumptions taken? What are some of the issues with the methodology? Just like our participants, right? They all mentioned that this is something that we could have done better, right? So all these assumptions should also be upfront. And again, there is some amount of uncertainty. There might be a possibility that the probability of a particular thing not happening might be there, right? So if all those things are there, it even makes it better. It helps the decision maker.
Yeah. Thank you all. Thank you, and we'll close this episode here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rama. Thanks, Krishna. Thanks, Shihas. To the listeners, we'll meet again in one more episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.